welcome to Season 8, Episode 4 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop, and I think you seem too subdued.
I'm sorry, I'll pick up the energy.
Right out of the box.
Yeah, there we go. We are, of course, reading George Lakoff's Moral Politics, How Liberals and Conservatives Think. This time we're finally kind of getting into a little bit of the meat of the book when he's setting forth his arguments about what morality is and stuff. So moving away from a lot of his introduction section and getting into how he actually sort of organizes his thoughts on how morality works. And we're reading two chapters here at the same time. That the first one, chapter 3, is like 2 pages long. So we're talking about what he defines as experiential morality, and then moving into how he kind of views morality as accounting, or how he thinks like humans view morality as a system of accounting and repayment and debt and stuff like that.
Yes. And what are your initial thoughts? Do you have any initial thoughts, or should I start spouting off?
I mean, I think his system is consistent with what he's saying. Like, I don't think he's being, hypocritical in any way. Like, if you assume like the premises that he's assuming, then his system makes logical sense. I don't know if I agree with it 100%, because essentially his premise is what he's talking about in chapter 3, that everything is based on experience. That's what our morality is defined by. He says, that's how we frame moral concepts in our own experiences. And so very much like, I don't know if he explicitly denies like any sort of reality of like ideals or anything like that, like looking at like, Platonic morality and stuff like that. But he definitely seems to favor more of like cause and effect type stuff for how we explain morality.
I agree. I feel like that like I would disagree partially with what you said initially. I still feel like he's still in an intro section of all this, because I'm trying. I keep having to kind of pull back and give him the author the benefit of the doubt of he says he's saying more than he's saying. So like he's making these declaratory statements about this morality system, but I feel like ultimately he's really just trying to explain two different ways to communicate political ideals based upon two different political philosophies. But he's making these declaratory statements about his experiential morality as if it is the morality.
And that's kind of what I'm saying is like if you accept that premise, yeah. Sorry, I keep cutting him off.
No, that's okay. No, I mean is he really saying that this is the true morality system that we are all operating under? He does say that, but then he kind of pulls back every once in a while. And I feel like maybe he's just describing how we talk about morality and politics. And if he is asserting that this is an explanation of morality and what people believe and why people believe it, then it's really lacking. It's really surface level, undergraduate, pot smoking, BS session level philosophy. If it's an intro to trying to explain, the primary ways in which the two parties explain their political views with a subtext of moral code words, I guess. I think he has some merit there, but he seems to be overstating and understating at the same time. It's really hard for me to figure out at this point where he's really going with this, because he's describing this, and I guess maybe I'll just kind of get into it. This chapter 3, which talks about experiential morality, which he's like you said, he's kind of doing a cause and effect type analysis of morality. It's just he's arguing that political perspectives are derived from systems of moral concepts. Okay, fine. Every political philosopher that has rendered an opinion about morality and politics has said that same statement. Okay, well that's a given. And then he says, basically that it's just experiential, which is he says moral philosophy is to improve the well-being of others, yourself and others, I guess. And then he defines well-being in very practical and very physical ways. He's talking about, you'd rather be rich than poor, strong than weak, freer than imprisoned, cared for than uncared for, happy rather than sad, whole rather than lacking, clean rather than filthy. And then he says this, he says, beautiful rather than ugly. And I don't know that really is a moral belief. I think that is, he's describing societal, I guess, very, what do you say? Like, people that don't have a lot of depth, these are the values of people that don't have morality.
Yeah.
Right. They don't have a higher calling. They don't have any sort of spirituality. These are the practical things that, if you're just talking about economics, these are the values you'd have, right? Yeah. You'd say, okay, well, you want an economic system that makes people richer rather than poorer. Yeah. You want an economic system that your country is stronger rather than weak, and you have health care rather than, care for people, their health and all that. And I'm on top page 42. But all of these, what he calls this experiential morality is really just physical stuff. It really has nothing to do with morality. It has to do with improving your lot in life in the physical realm with wealth and stuff, right?
Yeah, it's very, I mean, I think I agree with what you're saying. It's very surface level, but I think that's really going to be a flaw throughout this book. So I think that's what he's saying is like proven to be true, is like that this is how it works. Because he says, this is back on the prior page, like an important conclusion of research and cognitive studies is that moral thinking is an imaginative and that it depends fundamentally on metaphorical understanding. But he says then non-metaphorical morality, so aside from how we just talk about it, is about the experience of well-being. So he's saying even outside of how we frame things, how we talk about things, he's accepting this like this is the basis of all of our moral systems, is based on this experience of well-being. And so he's just like asserting this. And I think you're right. It's very flimsy, where it's just like, well, yeah, we'd rather be this thing rather than that thing. Therefore, that proves that this is a moral system. And I think it's a system of like surface level preferences, to be like in life. And I think a lot of those are tied to morality for sure. But I don't think that is the basis for a moral system. Like I think, there is, a moral, point in being, strong rather than weak, cared for rather than uncared for. Like there's moral principles in there, but those are not the principles themselves, if that makes sense.
Yeah. He's really describing like Andrew Tate's philosophy of life, right? Like those influencers that just care about, working out and looking good and getting the women and then leaving them and having fast cars and stuff. I mean, that's not really a moral system. It's just hedonism. Yeah. And I believe that I think he's inadvertently anti-Christian, or maybe pre-Christian. Like the pre-Christian philosophers would agree with this more than Christian philosophers would, after Jesus came. And I'm just really struck by the moral philosophy would say you'd want to be beautiful rather than ugly. I think that really just struck me, because I don't know that there's any form, is there any religious belief or moral belief that talks about physical beauty being a moral good, moral better than a physical ugliness?
I mean, not about people. I think we see it about physical objects now, where it's like we think, a church should be beautiful rather than ugly and things like that. We see that like in art and stuff. So we have like a standard of beauty that's tied to an understanding of reality and what is good and things like that. But I don't think I really ever see that tied to humans, at least in post-Christian times. But I think you're right on the point. I wasn't even thinking about that. But this is very similar to like pre-Christian, especially like Roman ideals, where everything is just defined in terms of, sort of respect and honor. And like, this is what the sign of a good man, as if he has, wealth and benefits. It's almost a sort of like Stoic philosophy in a way, in that like, your lot in life is sort of emblematic of how the gods favor you. And so your lot in life is just to bear what has been given to you. And so if you have more money, then that's a sign that you have been approved by the gods and things like that. So it's like very much like things defined by their opposites is how his moral system's working here.
True, and I also think he'd probably be offended by this, but I think he's much more similar to libertarian transactionalists, like they value contract theory of morality, and that's really what he's putting forward. It is really just relationship, like you said. You're worthless relative to what people think of you, or what your relationship was with them. And I think he would have. He's saying, what are the differences in the moral systems, and what is the source of those differences? That's what he's going to get into. But when he says at the top of 43, we expect to see. He says we expect to see morality conceptualize its strength, because it's better to be healthy than sick, et cetera, et cetera. But really, he should have confined his theory to the languages that are used, and say these are the kind of writ large kind of moral language we use, without saying this is a moral system. Like he's a philosopher of morality. And I think it would be better for him to say, well, there's a language is used to explain a moral system that uses terms associated with wealth, et cetera, as metaphors for the benefits of morality. Because he's really focused on this metaphor thinking, and you have to communicate your moral system some way. And the best thing to do it is like through metaphors or parables, like Jesus did. And he seems to he's saying essentially, because we use metaphors or parables or whatever, but he's saying metaphors, and usually used in financial terms, then that is the financial transactional relationship is the basis for morality, as opposed to really the most effective way to put it in context that's not based upon your moral system. If you're trying to communicate your moral system to somebody, you're using examples and metaphors. But you have a moral system separate from that, is more fundamental. And I don't think he understands that. He certainly doesn't explain it that way. He's saying the metaphors, are the basis of it, really.
Yeah. I think it's he's like chicken and egging himself in a way, where it's like he can't figure out which is coming first, and so he's kind of putting them, equal with each other, as if they like just both emerged at the same time. And I've been writing a paper for one of my classes about like how you can use art to represent morality and things like that, and represent God and stuff like that. And John Paul II has a great letter. He wrote like an encyclical letter to in 1999 to like all artists, and he has some really nice language in there about like art is making clear, especially religious art, that which is like inherently unable to be represented. And it's like he's completely missing that point. It's like when you paint a picture of God, we know that's not really what God looks like, because God is almost impossible, to represent in a way. It's like when you're putting your values, into like Tolkien with his idea of subcreation. You can write this fictional world that embodies real, true morality and things like that, without it actually being, a real, like, this is what is good and this is what is bad, but it's, imbued within the whole work. And he's kind of missing that. He's just seems to say like, well, these metaphors, kind of missing that there could be something higher and something unseen behind it. Where he's just saying the metaphor, therefore, is the moral system itself in a way. And it feels like he's trying to say that he's not saying that, but I feel like the way he's going about writing the book seems to imply that.
Yes. Yeah. And yeah, you're right. And that's where I'm kind of, I'm starting to like, like when I was reading, I kind of argue with him in my head, like that's not right. But then I'm thinking, well, maybe he's just trying to make a point of how we communicate about these concepts. And maybe he's not talking about morality. Maybe he's just talking about how we talk about morality. That makes sense.
It seems like he is talking about what he thinks morality is, because he says at the beginning of the chapter there, where he's like, well, everything's a system of metaphors, but there is, non-metaphorical morality. There is objective morality. And then he just kind of says, well, we would rather be rich rather than poor. That means that like the richness is the moral thing. But I think that's how we express morality. That's an offshoot of a moral system rather than the moral system itself.
This is the prime example of where the exception swallows the rule. Some morality is beyond this metaphor explanation. Yeah, all of it. So anyway, I think that kind of gives us a segue. He's trying to explain this moral system, which is It's all based upon physical stuff, and it's experiential morality.
Hmm.
As he's trying to, and really, he's overstating it by calling it more a moral system.
Hmm.
He should be talking about it more of a. It really, it seems to me that he's trying to say that we use. We're really talking about a transactional system, but we use some terms that are also used to describe morality. But we should be talking about transactions. I kind of figured that's what he's ultimately going to say.
Yeah.
Is that what you should be focused on is, okay, what works the best to solve these problems to make everybody more healthy and wealthy and wise. And this group uses these moral terms to try to focus on this advocacy or these policies, and the other side uses different terms to advocate a different policy set and leave this moral system out of it, because he's really not going in any depth to understand, to explain this whatever he thinks is moral. But I think he puts it in here because he's going to hit us a little whammy in like chapter 14, where he once we accept his premise that this is a moral system, then he says, well, if the moral system is this, then all you conservatives are bastards, you rat bastards. So we have to explain to everybody that we do not buy his moral system such as he has explained it. And then he gets into, chapter 4 is probably, I'm guessing, is like the meat and potatoes of his theory.
Yeah, it's like the next 3 chapters are like the different metaphorical systems. And so like the first one is, as I'm sure you're just about to say, is the accounting metaphor. And then he goes into father and then like nurturing mother metaphors. And it's like these are like the 3 core systems that I think he sees in existence.
Well, I gather that he thinks the keeping of the moral books, as he calls this next chapter, is the foundation. And then the 2 paths diverge from that foundation, basically the strong father or the strict father, and then the nurturing mother theories, I guess. And so what does he talk about? Keep them moral books. And it's all this language that is about, I'm indebted to you. If you do something nice to me, then I'm indebted to you. And I mean, that's really where it all comes down to.
Yeah.
But he's saying we conceptualize well-being as a wealth. And I think he has it reversed. Again, I'm going to say this probably 10 times, but we have to explain why we're spiritually better if we are more moral. Mm-hmm. And how do you explain that to somebody else in terms that they understand, like in their own terms and their own day-to-day experiences? You use a metaphor of wealth, right? And so I think he's saying that we conceptualize well-being as wealth, but we really don't. We can conceptualize our soul and our well-being differently than actually money that will get us stuff, right? But we have to use some terms that are common to everybody, and so we kind of describe it as wealth, like that you will earn reward in heaven. But they don't mean that you're going to get stuff in heaven. Mm-hmm. You're going to have a reward for your soul and your true well-being, which, and then you won't care about your physical being. You won't care about whether you're stronger than anybody else or whether you're more beautiful than anybody else. All that stuff goes away because you get down to the fundamental, but you have to be able to communicate. Well, if you live a good life and a just life and you honor God and follow Jesus and all that stuff, I'm talking about Christianity, of course, but there's every religion has their own path towards spiritual enlightenment that they describe, but they have to describe it in words and language. And I think the most effective way to do that is in parables or metaphors. And I think he's saying the opposite, that the metaphors are first. Don't you think?
Yeah, because it's like when he's saying, will we frame morality in terms of wealth and accounting and stuff, because we feel this desire to be squared off with each other, and it's all just like accounting. But he's not asking the question, okay, why do we think it's just to not be indebted to people? Why is that the moral principle? He's just assuming, again, it's that same thing. If he's not looking higher for the actual principle behind it, he's just looking for the experiential outcome of that principle. And the experience that we have is that we feel indebted to people. If they do something good for us, then we feel an urge to do something good for them. not because, all of the things that we think about are in terms of accounting, but because, we recognize that, if somebody does something good for me, I should do something good for them, because that's a moral concept. There's something moral about justice and about helping people out when they need it. And it's not like just, well, everything's numbers in my mind. I'm not keeping a tally of how many favors somebody's done for me.
And at times he seems to get that. Like he mentions in 45, we talk about costs of a fire and earthquake. He says we do not mean just the monetary cost, but also the cost in human well-being, deaths, injuries, suffering, trauma, and other things. And we talk about profiting from experience, but we're talking about how we gain something from that knowledge or enjoyment or whatever. And so I think he understands that these are terms that are used to explain something deeper, but he doesn't go there, so, and he does say, the use, the well-being, conceptualizing well-being as wealth is a metaphor that is ubiquitous. I agree. Mm-hmm. And I think he's making a good point at the core of his point, but I think he's trying to gloss over this, kind of glam onto this moral system as if he's thinking something new. Because I think if he just says, and we talk about politics using metaphors based upon our moral system that resonates with us and explains public policy in terms that we can consistently understand in our moral framework, like through Christians and references to the Bible, he's not saying anything anybody else hasn't already said a million times. So I think he's trying to say something more, and he's not.
Yeah.
But so then he goes on and he talks about, he's talking about the metaphor of well-being as wealth can be combined with a very general metaphor for causal action, in which causation is seen as object transfer, mm-hmm. as in the giving of effect to the affected party. And the way I look at it, it's that the wealth, the spiritual wealth and the moral wealth is an end in and of itself. Mm-hmm. It's not a good that's exchanged, and it's not relative to someone else, and there is no limit to it. There's no. He seems to have an idea that there is a maximum amount of moral good.
Yeah.
And I think he would reject the statement that, a rising tide lifts all ships, mm-hmm. type of view of morality, that we can all just be better people. I don't have to have an exchange with someone and be indebted to them or them indebted to me because I did a good thing. If I'm doing a good thing for somebody, I don't want them indebted to me, mm-hmm. right? Because then or like the concept that, that Jesus said something along the lines, I'm terrible at quoting Jesus, but, those, what is it, the Pharisees or whoever it was that made a big show of how generous they were and how pious they were. And he said that they have the reward here on earth during their lifetime. If you're pious and you're generous privately, then your reward will come later. So it's a complete refutation from what he's saying. I think the author is talking about, and there's a lot of moral systems that believe that you shouldn't be patting yourself on the back and keeping a ledger, and there's no ledger that we keep. You should just do the right thing. Well, I think it's not like somebody owes you, right?
Yeah. I think he's assuming morality always has to come to a net zero. There always has to be somebody who's always indebted to someone else. There's always it's almost like a yin and yang concept in a way, where it's always there's always going to be something bad that's balancing out the good, and we're always just trying to level everything out. And I don't think that's true. I think people do good things without expecting something in return, and often don't get anything in return. And we just do good things because we know that it's a good thing to do, because we have a higher, more foundational moral system, rather than just if I do good thing, then I get, something good in return.
Well, and even that's quite what he says that. He says that on 46 at the top of the page. He says, and just as it is important that the financial books be balanced, so it is important that the moral books be balanced. According to who? Who says that? Yeah, there are no moral books be balanced. I mean, that no major religion says there's a ledger. These are all metaphors about your moral obligations to other people in the sense of business transactions. And it means something to people in our neck of the woods. Where they say, a handshake deal is enforceable in my neck of the woods,
Mm-hmm.
because you have a moral obligation to fulfill what you had said, but that's not the end of it. That's a symptom, right? That's not what has caused that moral obligation. You have a system of morality that you would never promise to do something you wouldn't do. And it's not just that there's a transaction I now owe you.
Mm-hmm.
It's that I have a higher responsibility. Even if I don't want to do it anymore, I'm supposed to do the right thing, that type of thing. But anyway, so then he talks about the moral accounting scheme. So he talks about different concepts, which are financial concepts
Mm-hmm.
that he thinks supports his view that this is this experiential morality system. The first one is reciprocation, which we had just kind of basically talked about, which is if I have a debt, I owe you something, and it's immoral if I don't. If an immoral action is giving something of a negative value, as opposed to giving something of a positive value. It's a debt payment principle, and so if I do something, you have to reciprocate, and it's this very transactional view of morality and moral relationships, and I think he probably is doing a decent job of explaining a business ethics class,
Mm-hmm.
such as it is, rather than a moral system that's deeper than that. If you're just going to be talking about, okay, what's the right thing or wrong thing to do as a business person? Yeah, within that limited framework, you're talking about reciprocating promises and obligations, but I don't think it says as much as he thinks it does. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think this is, I've kind of, coming to the conclusion, this is exactly, what nominalism has led to. If you're someone who thinks that everything is just words and there's no higher, value to anything, then of course you're going to think this way. Of course the system is going to line up with how you view morality, because everything is just then based on your experience, because there can be nothing higher. And I think that is where a lot of linguists end up, is in this nominalist camp, where everything is just, a societal construct. Everything is just a word that we've used to name something, and so the word itself becomes the moral system. So it's very much like, well, if we talk about it in this way, then that must be how morality actually functions. I think he's absolutely right that we do talk about morality this way. And I think he makes a good point there, that we do talk in terms of repaying debts. When we're saying, he did something good for me, I should do something good for him. I want to repay that favor. But it's not because we're inherently like accounting based, creatures in a way. It's like because we know that there's a moral good in helping people,
Yeah. Again, to the pot smoking undergraduate reference, he reminds me of a 22-year-old atheist who is asked, well, if there's no God, then do you have, is it just the might makes right? Or is there any sort of moral system you can believe in? Well, yeah. You have this transactional, how we talk about metaphors and this experiential morality and reciprocation, and then the next one, retribution.
Mm-hmm.
And it is an ethical system, but it's surface level.
Yeah.
It's a second level moral system. Like the moral system, the morality in the moral system has to be underneath this. And then you talk about your morality and your moral system with these transactional terms and how it applies practically. So I think I think we've talked about this. You mentioned it before. That you don't believe in a God-based system or natural law. This is how you talk about those kind of ethical issues. As I think he's talking about ethics and not morality. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It reminds me a lot of like how, atheists try to explain like how we, evolved morality through, like learning it. Because I think this is exactly the argument that a lot of people say is like, when you point out, well, how do we have such a complex system of morality? As well, back, the primitive humans, just recognized that if I did something good for someone else, then they did something good for me. And then somehow we came to recognize, this massive, in some cases, theological system based off of that one simple principle. And it just completely misses a lot of the point and simplifies religion and morality to an extent where I think they think that it is actually transactional. Like, I don't think he thinks that. I think he thinks that he's absolutely correct here. That he thinks that this is how things actually work, and it's a weird way to look at things. I think very simplistic.
Yeah, and then he goes on to, and I think this is where they really get tied up into knots. in the non-religious moral systems where there's no God, retribution, punishment. As he mentions, I'll pay you back with interest. Ha! I'm going to get you back. And he says moral transactions get complicated in the case of negative action. Yeah, well, I think all religions get a little complicated when you talk about negative reactions. And he says he does end up, I think, in this section. Did he mention Christianity at some point? But he mentions, by harming you, I've taken. This is on 48. By harming you, I've taken something of value from you. Are you going to let me get away with it? And of course, a good Christian, which I'm not always a good Christian, will say, yeah, I'm going to let you get away with it. You can do it twice,
He talks about it later, I think, which is...
Yeah, he does mention it. I don't know if it's in this section. Or
I think he specifically talks about how we come to like a turning the other cheek system later on.
Right. And so he talked about the death payment principle, and you can act basically to punish people. And he says in debates over the death penalty, this is I think caught my eye. In debates over the death penalty, liberals rank absolute goodness over retribution, of course, and conservatives tend to prefer retribution, a life for a life. That was more common in the 90s, but it was not common for religious conservatives because a big section of the population that is against the death penalty are in fact Christian conservatives, not because they think it's, but basically because the Ten Commandments says don't kill, and all that. So he overgeneralizes, of course, because he wants liberals to look good because they rank absolute goodness over retribution. And he says absolute goodness puts the priority on principles as opposed to the punishment and retribution for bad things, and conservatives are on the other side of that, but whatever. But he does mention when a man takes the law into his own hands and shoots his brother's murderer, that is revenge. And I think that's true. Because he talks about legitimate authority being the arbiter of a just sentence. But I think it depends upon the justice system, and that's where the breakdown is occurring in our inner cities because people are getting away with murder, literally. And they, used to have a solving rate, 90+%, a clearance rate and prosecution and all that. Now, in some communities, it's like less than 50%. So I don't know that this statement is universal as it once was because we don't really have a just justice system. And what are you really going to do if your brother's killer is not going to be punished? Is it revenge or is it justice?
It also
I'm not advocating for killing killers, but he oversimplifies everything.
Well, it also brings up the point, if you're making that distinction, how do you even come to a notion of what is just authority and what isn't? Because that's kind of unexplainable with how he sets things up. If everything is based on transactions, then it shouldn't matter who is doing the transaction as long as like the moral wrongs are equaled out. You know what I mean? Because it's like, if you think it's bad and you deserve punishment because you've killed someone, then it shouldn't matter who that punishment is coming to or is coming from, as long as, it comes to net zero eventually. You wouldn't have a distinction between retribution and revenge. I think if you're really working within the system, you have to have some sort of other outside concept of morality to determine what even is just authority, to determine that. But I don't know. I don't really know where he's coming from there.
Yeah. I think it's just blowing smoke. So the next one is restitution, which is what restitution is make it right. You stole from me and pay it back. But he's talking about very brief. He says if I do something harmful to you, then I have to give something of negative value. Then by moral arithmetic, taking something of positive value. And he says, of course, in many cases, full restitution is impossible, but partial restitution may be possible. And then just kind of moves on. But that's then he talks about altruism. I think this is where he talks about, no, maybe it's not here. But he says, if you have altruism, Like if I do something positive for you, you're in my debt. He says in a moral system, he says it again. This is where I'm getting confused by him. I'm trying to give him the benefit of the doubt, but he says in a moral system, the moral books must be balanced. And I have on here says who, where does he get this? He just asserts it. He just throws it in the book. And that's where I mentioned in my notes, about you've been given your reward on earth. If you're keeping score of, who done you wrong and who done you right, you're doing it wrong. I mean, as far as a moral system. Oh yeah. Then he talks about turning the other cheek. He has to acknowledge that concept in with as many Christians here. And he says, turning the other cheek involves the rejection of retribution and revenge and the acceptance of basic goodness. And when it works via the mechanism of moral accounting.
Yeah, but it just doesn't make any sense because it breaks it. And he even kind of says that it's by moral accounting, either harming you further or accepting something good from you would incur even further debt. By turning the other cheek, you make me even more morally indebted to you. So it inherently doesn't work because it completely breaks that idea. If you hit me and I turn around and let you hit me again, then it's just me, being more. I don't know. It just doesn't make sense how you can work that within moral arithmetic. It's completely denying all of that. That's exactly what Jesus said. That the old law was eye for an eye. And let's turn the other cheek. And it just doesn't work within the system that he's setting forward.
Correct. It's an aberration that he can't explain, so he just discards it. It says
it's its own thing. It belongs over here, but it still fits,
somehow.
Yeah.
But then he talks about karma, which is always an interesting concept to me, which I think is just so wrong-headed because bad people really profit during their lives quite often.
Yeah.
Although they aren't always living happy lives, like those evil communist jerks in China, like Mao Zedong. I didn't know this, but almost all of them were on had to take sleeping pills. Lots of them every night. They couldn't go to sleep. They're always anxious about somebody undermining them or killing them or usurping their authority. So I guess in a sense maybe there was some karma going around, but the karma is what goes around comes around. I think it's an old Indian concept.
It's Buddhist concept, yeah.
A Buddhist, sorry. And I don't know what he even says about this. He just mentions it. Just as it's a moral accounting with the universe. Yeah. So I guess people people say that, but is it part of a moral system? I think it's really just people trying to reassure themselves that that bad people will meet their meet justice when it comes around, and they're just not going to empowered to do it themselves, I guess.
I mean, I do think that does fit in this system more than the other things that he's talked about a little bit. If you truly believe that bad things happen to bad people and good things happen to good people, I mean, I think that is a system of moral accounting at its base level. If you rack up enough bad things, then you will get bad things in return. You know what I mean? So I think
but he's talking about this just as people say these things. That's what this little 2-paragraph section is. Karma is moral accounting with the universe. Okay, well, I agree with that as far as it goes, but what difference does that make? To paraphrase Hillary Clinton.
I mean, that's kind of what I was mentioning last time. I think that's one of my big problems with a lot of modern linguistics is they don't want to ask why. Why is this the case? They just say people say this, and then therefore they say this. They're not actually concerned with what the purpose of language is anymore.
Yes,
if people say this, therefore this proves this. And it's a very oversimplified way of looking at things, I think.
All right, so I think he goes on and about different concepts, reward and punishment. If a person getting a reward.
And this is where he explicitly talks about Christianity, which I thought this discussion was interesting, and I think just kind of wrong. Because it goes into, talking about reward and punishment, about Old Testament with God punishing Adam and Eve for taking bites out of a fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Said the punishment was banishment from the Garden of Eden, loss of immortality, things like that. He says the issue wasn't the fruit itself. The issue was disobedience, which is right to a degree, the violation of the debt repayment principle upon which all authority rests. Eating the fruit was not just eating a fruit, it was metaphorically a loss of innocence and giving in to the temptation to satisfy one's desire. Therefore to disobedience and things like that. And then he says, weirdly, God relented somewhat and offered back immortality and freedom from suffering, not to all mankind, but on a one-by-one basis. Each person who accepted God's legitimate authority and who became sufficiently self-disciplined to overcome the temptations of the flesh and obey God's commandments for the remainder of his life on earth would get everlasting life and relief from suffering in heaven. So he's putting all of, Christian morality in this reward and punishment system, that everything started with that initial punishment and we're trying to work back to that net zero. And he's completely missing the point of Christian morality, which is that none of us deserve, eternal life. That is the Christian teaching, is that we can't really work to get it because none of us deserve it, no matter what we do. We should try and develop, like a relationship with God, and follow his commandments and stuff. But at the end of the day, not a single person is going to be 100% perfect. But he seems to think that that is how Christianity works, is that we all, whoever goes to heaven is the 100% perfect person who's able to net zero out all his debt to God.
Well, gosh, I forget. I should have looked it up. In the history of the Catholic Church, there was a big fight over this, whether or not you can earn a spot. I forget. Wasn't there a Protestant religion that believed that you could earn a spot? And of course, the Calvinists said you're preordained or not, you can't earn a spot in. Yeah. I mean, there's been discussions about this in Christian thinkers for a long time, But I don't think he's a Christian, because he says in a common interpretation of the Old Testament, God punished Adam and Eve. I don't even know, what is he trying to say in this?
Yeah,
is he saying that this is morality, or is he just addressing these Christian concepts to try to force them into his system so that the reader will follow him? Maybe I don't know, because he's not saying he believes in God.
And this is the most. This was like the point in the book when I'm like, okay, maybe he just doesn't really know what he's talking about. Because it's like, even with, his setting up of the story of the Garden of Eden, it was about disobedience and stuff. But, why was that disobedience, bad? Because I think a lot of people now look at that and it's like, well, isn't it good to have knowledge? Why wouldn't you want to eat from the tree of knowledge of life and death? And it's like, well, yeah, I mean, that kind of makes sense. We would want to have that knowledge. But the point was they were making themselves like God. They were assuming that they knew better. And you can't really put that in a moral system like he has here. You can't really say why it is bad to want to make yourself like God. You can't put it into terms, if you think it's all just based on experience, you'd want that knowledge. That is an inherently good thing in that system. And they just wouldn't be able to wrap his mind around it. And he clearly just doesn't really understand the Christian morality there. Maybe like what you're saying, some sects think that, you can, physically earn it, net zero it out. But I don't think that that's the prevailing theory among most Christian denominations.
Yeah, well, and he ends that whole section by saying there are, of course, other interpretations in which God's grace is given heavier weight than his authority. That is, where positive action is given a heavier weight than obedience, which is a form of debt payment. This is chapter 14. And I'm thinking, whoa, watch out for 14, because he's coming for us. I don't know what's going to be in 14. I didn't even look at the title of it. But he's really making it like a transactional thing with God, for sure. And it's a debt payment thing because of original sin. And so he's trying to force it into his system. I don't know. But
chapter 14 is titled Two Models of Christianity. So we'll get to his thoughts.
Here it comes. Yeah. One side's gonna be all rainbows and gays. No, I don't know. I'm just saying that. Anywho, so the next section he talks about in this keeping the moral books chapter is work. He talks about two different common metaphors for work. One being the basically exchange, the contract exchange, and the other one is just authority. What does he call it? He's an exchange metaphor, the work exchange, reward metaphor. So, I think he does describe these somewhat accurate. But one of just contract law that basically work is an object of value. The worker is a possessor of his work. The employer is a possessor of his money, and the employment is a voluntary exchange of the workers work for the employer's money. That's economist's view of it. He talks about this other one, which is, I don't know if anybody believes this anymore or follows this, that basically an employer has a right, because he's the employer, just to give orders and to punish the employee for not obeying the orders. And the obedience is a condition of employment. The social relationship of the employer-employee is one of superior and inferior and the employer knows best. The employee is moral if he obeys the employer, and the employer is moral if he appropriately rewards the employee for obeying his orders. I mean, is that even maybe in other societies? I guess, and I think maybe in like 18th century America and England, I think that, but that was probably pretty accurate. But even the 1990s, that was considered like old fashioned, that you would just, that you're like almost like a slave with a wage,
that's what I was going to say.
Subhuman.
It's like a servant master morality where it's like, you could be a morally good master if you provide for your servant or your slave, in your role as master. Like I think that's what he's kind of talking about there.
Yeah.
As long as you appropriately care for them, then it's a moral thing. That's sort of the framework he's looking at this with.
But I don't see the moral system and the moral accounting in either theory, really. I guess more so in this old servant master, as you correctly point out, idea of labor contracts, but certainly not the other one. But and then he talks about some other basic moral concepts of credit and trust, of moral capital. A moral action is part of an exchange by this moral accounting concept. And basically, he talks about you place your trust in someone morally is to give an advanced moral credit. So I'm giving you a loan of moral credit when I trust you. And to be trusted, a person has to build trust to establish a history of being trustworthy, a moral credit rating.
Yeah.
Fair enough. That's true. And if you're reliable, people will rely upon you. But I don't know. I don't know what that has anything to do with anything. But
I like his next section, which is a 2-sentence description of what justice is. And I think if your moral system, allows you to have a 2-sentence description of what is just, then I think your moral system needs to be a little bit more fleshed out. Because it's essentially what we've been saying. His concept of justice is net zero, settling the books. And then he just moves on. And that's what he says, that how we understand justice.
Justice is settling of the accounts, which results in the balancing of the moral books. Who really believes that? Yeah. I mean, I guess he does.
Maybe.
Atheists, communists, socialists, other evil people that are not necessarily atheists, communists, and socialists. And I'm not ruling out that those people are all evil.
I'm kind of hoping that, in the next chapter, he'll say, okay, but this is what these people believe about justice. But I think it does seem like this is what he's setting up, like, for every other system to be based off of. So it's I think like this is what he's going to be working with. I hope that I'm proven wrong when I read the next chapter, but it seems like that's what he's doing.
Yes. And then he talks about rights and duties, and he has an excerpt from Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, which he talks about this metaphor that Martin Luther King is a really effective part of the speech, where he talks about in the speech, this part of the speech, he's really speaking to white America, to talk about the patriotic argument for equal rights. And he's using the metaphor of a promissory note that people understand. People understand getting a loan and promising to pay back a loan. And so he's saying the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. So you inherited this promise from the founders, and America has defaulted on this promise for some of us. It's a great analogy. It's a great metaphor to explain in very simple financial terms the moral basis for treating everybody equally and treating them consistently as equals under the Constitution, as individuals. But Martin Luther King is not equating promissory notes with the moral obligation. He's explaining the moral obligation. So the underlying premise of the argument is there are certain God-given rights that we all have, which of course is in the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, specifically the Declaration of Independence. And the second level argument, or maybe third level argument, is this promissory note transactional explanation of the God-given rights to all of us as individuals, as sons and daughters of God, And this is an explanation of how it applies to all of us. And he's saying this is the first level morality. And it's just weird to me that he doesn't recognize that.
Yeah. Well, it's like, reading, the parable of the mustard seed, in the New Testament, and saying, morality is an agricultural based system. It's like we can think about morality in terms of agriculture because that's something that we understand. But it's like he's looking at this and saying, okay, well, we use these metaphors, these financial metaphors. Therefore, we must inherently understand morality as a financial system. It's like we don't inherently understand morality as an agricultural system. We can use agricultural terms to examine it and put it in clear words, but that doesn't mean we think about it like agriculture.
Yeah, thank you. Because it would also all the references to sheep and the shepherd. Yeah. And the what's the tares and the wheat and the what is it the chaff, the harvesting of the wheat and separating out the weeds later and all that stuff. I mean, yeah, you're right. That's a great way to look at it because he's so focused on this financial transaction language that's used to explain morality. You could say, hey, a moral system is just agricultural.
Yeah, I mean,
the Christian world is agricultural, so that's great.
It's like it's ignoring the point that Jesus was talking to people who would understand those things, and so of course he's putting morality, a more abstract system, into more concrete concepts, to make it easier to understand.
Well, and after he quotes Martin Luther King, he says at the bottom of that page, what is this, 57, this understanding of rights is not mere rhetoric. And I have in margins, yes, it is. He says, it is one of two understandings that we have of rights in general. If rights in general are understood as rights to property, then there are two special cases of property is land. The right is a right of way, that is a right to access your property. If property is money, there's a right to have your money given to you. I mean, it is mere rhetoric. The explanation that Martin Luther King made was rhetoric. Yeah. Right. I mean, his rhetoric about this land and money analogies is just words on paper. That's not a moral system. But anyway, all right. So then I do think he's gonna run into some problems later in the book because he talks about rights and duties fit together, which is true. Whenever someone has a right, someone else has a duty, and conversely. And I have circled this. If you have a right to an education, someone has a duty to provide it, and that's a fundamental issue in the two different philosophies of government, because there are individual rights, which are basically freedom rights, right to be free from government interference. And then there's the leftists that have rights to entitlement and the right to have other people do things for them. Yes. And that's where you really have to split. And he doesn't, he recognizes this. If you have a right to an education, someone has a duty to provide it. That's true. That means somebody's got to pony up to educate you. Same thing with healthcare. Same thing with all these government services. If you have a right to it, somebody else has to pay for it. And that becomes a problem when you have too many of these so-called rights that somebody else has to provide to you, as opposed to the right to be left alone and do what you want.
Yeah. Well, it's like the whole system falls apart for them when you say, well, we have a right to bear arms in the Constitution. When is the government going to give me my free gun? Because like they understand, in terms of, right from government interference there, to an extent. A lot of them don't agree with that anymore. But it's like, but they assume, if I have a right, he even points out, this is a weird one. Like if you have you cannot have a right to breathe clean air unless others have a duty to refrain from polluting it or guarantee that there is clean air to breathe. It's such a weird example to throw in there and to like use as saying, this is what rights and duties are about. Because I don't know. It's just a weird way.
That's a different concept. He doesn't understand the difference between the two. Like the right to an education means somebody's got to give you an education. The right to breathe clean air means someone else can't inhibit your right to be free of that nuisance, because that's an interference with you enjoying life, as opposed to somebody else providing something to you. And he doesn't understand the distinction between those two concepts. And I think we're going to hear a lot about that later, that he's going to be confused by the differentiation between those two, because those are polar opposite arguments. One is, I have a right to be free from you screwing stuff up. And that's the clean air, clean water argument, which is fine. And I think, the vast majority of Americans agree with that, both, right, left, center, everybody.
Mhm.
It's when you start talking about the right to get something else for you as an individual, and then that means other people have to provide it to you.
Mhm.
That's a huge difference.
Yeah.
And he doesn't get the distinction, but like most left wing people don't. They think, well, but I'm wanting clean air. Yeah, that's different. That just means somebody can't pollute your air.
Mhm.
Okay, it's all our air. It's a commons problem,
Mhm.
and he didn't get it. Anyway, so he does mention the communist critique of rights, and he mentions, where is that? Or maybe that's later.
Top of 59.
59.
Yeah, he says it's not always clear that when certain people get more rights, the same people get more duties. This has led to what's called the communitarian critique of rights. It says that having rights given to you by the community confers upon you duties to the community. If the right is a letter of moral credit and a duty is moral debt, the credits and debits should balance out. Maybe I was looking at the wrong thing, but yeah.
No, that I have that circled too, because he is insisting that you're being given rights by the community, that you're not born with rights. And that's the fundamental difference between the two political philosophies. That's at the core, and then the other things spread out from there. But he thinks in this exchange argument, he's going to be making the argument that, well, you've been given these privileges, you've been given this and given that, and so you have a duty to everybody else to provide stuff for them. So that is a key, and we're going to see that later. But he does quote the Marxist stuff later, I think, and we'll get to that. Gosh, how long is this chapter? Okay,
There's
we're getting
5 more pages. Yeah, we're almost
so
done.
then he has this talk about self-righteousness, which he talks about, you're keeping your own books. And if you keep your own books and you think that you're only have people indebted to you, then you're self-righteous, which I think is really interesting, because I believe he says the self-righteous, the first is that he recognizes no moral values other than his own as valid. And I have a margin saying Lakoff, because I think he is, he suffers from this. It seems to me. I mean, I don't know this man, but he's talking about defining self-righteousness as somebody who's keeping a bad scoreboard and not being honest about it, and everybody's indebted to him or her.
I mean, that's exactly what we talked about. Yeah, last season with, the relativists are usually the most judgmental because they're the only ones who are able to judge the morality. If you don't have a belief in some higher system, that's what's going to happen. I think that's exactly what's happening now with him. If he's looking at everything based on experience, based on, real world things, like, if everything in morality is based on, rich, not poor, then it's going to fall back onto you to determine what is moral based on how successful you are and how good things turn out for you. So I think he's inadvertently lumping himself into this category of self-righteous, and he doesn't realize it.
Whoops. And then the next section was kind of a longer one, is about fairness, which of course that's what all the leftists want to talk about as they define it. But he does a fairly decent job of describing it initially about different concepts of fairness. There's different models of fairness, and thank goodness he at least talks about that. But he says, in short, fairness is about equitable distribution of objects of value. I don't know, either positive or negative value. I don't know if that's a great way to view it, but but I think he's correct that people think that in concepts of that's not fair, they're cheating or whatever. And he describes it as an equal chance of winning if there's a game and that sort of thing. But he does recognize on 61 that equality of distribution is very different from equality of opportunity, which is very true. And then he mentions the communist slogan, from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs. And he says that's a composite of two schemas, the scalar distribution of responsibility and need-based distribution. So so he has the distribution of responsibility. Talks about, well, each according to his abilities. So you have more of a responsibility to do more because you are able to do more, and then each according to his needs is a need-based distribution that you only get what you need. But in practice, it just means despotism. But it's I thought it was interesting that he quoted that without describing the difficulties in administering such a schema.
Yes.
But anyway, so then he gives a summary. I don't know if you had any comments about that, but he had a summary. That he says that there is a fundamental economic metaphor behind much of morality, and I think he's right that there are metaphors, but they're not behind morality. They're secondary to morality.
Yes.
And that's the way I keep saying the same thing. I'm sorry. And he says, such moral schemes are not usually thought of as metaphorical because the well-being as wealth metaphor is so commonplace in everyday life. But the way he's talking about, they are metaphors. The way we talk about things are metaphors to describe what is metaphysical and more foundational. But I was kind of hoping he'd get into, even if I disagree with how he talks about moral systems, he says in the next two chapters they're going to examine the two family-based moral systems, the strict father morality and nurture of parent morality. I wish he would get off of these systems and start talking about his real theory, which is the two different main philosophical, political thought describe things using these two themes. They're really themes. They're not moral systems.
Yeah.
They're language themes. And he talks about resulting two different family-based moral systems. And I think that's true, that there are two different family-based moral systems, but the result is not these metaphors that are calling it. He says the metaphors for morality that are cited do exist in the conceptual systems of Americas. Well, the moral systems exist, and they use metaphors to explain those two separate moral systems. And he says he's right now, we are merely outlining two organizations of moral priorities at this point. I wish he would kind of just try to do that. Mm-hmm. But then I was thinking, well, maybe he's just explaining a view of these rather than it being his view. But he doesn't say that. He's just trying to just be descriptive of people's language and how they view things. He's saying that these are moral systems as in the metaphors themselves. It's very it's hard to really understand what he's saying.
Especially since he bounces between so many different systems in the chapter. He seems to be saying that this underlies, both Christian and Buddhist ethics. This is the underlying core human principle here, which is like, I just don't think that's true at all. Right. He's just completely misunderstanding a lot of philosophical and theological concepts. But
he's probably just glossing it over like a 22-year-old pothead.
Yeah. No, I think it'll be interesting going forward just to kind of compare him to Tolkien. Just to kind of look at the difference, between how linguistics or really linguists have changed in thinking over time. Because if you look at Tolkien and his whole theory of how, morality, because he had a very robust system of how language, encodes morality and things like that. But it was always because there's something higher that we can never really put into words. Mm-hmm. And now you have Lakoff here coming around, 20 years after Tolkien's death. And he seems to think that it is the words that are making the moral system. The words are the visible thing that is making up our whole moral system. So it's interesting to look at it in that way, I think. And I think it'll continue to be a pattern throughout the book.
Yes. Yeah, it seems like Lakoff is confusing cause and effect.
Yeah.
Or with cause.
Yeah, I would say so, yeah.
Not wild.
Mm-hmm.
And it's neat that you pointed out that how closely they were prominent linguists. It wasn't too long after Tolkien's death, but interesting. Well, it's well written, I'll say that. I mean, he is a fine writer, because I can read everything very quickly, and he I guess you'd say it's a page turner, so it's an interesting read.
Yeah, it is.
I wish he was clearer on whether he's asserting this as the truth, the way, or if he's just trying to describe how people talk about things. But because at some point he asserts it as what morality is, and other times it seems like he's just talking about it as a concept or a descriptive term. I don't know.
It's weird.
Maybe we'll kind of parse it out later.
Yeah, hopefully. Yes. Do you have any other final thoughts on these couple of chapters? All right. Well, this has been Season 8, Episode 4 of Unlimited Opinions. I have been Adam Bishop.
I'm still Mark Bishop.